I want to welcome you to Thrive in the Word. We're so glad that you're listening to this podcast. We're studying through the book of 1 John. And today we're in 1 John, the second chapter, starting with verse number 12. And John has really been talking very straight to the church, to the New Testament church. And he's said some things that are pretty strong in these prior verses to verse number 12. But now John is changing his tune. Now he's still believing what he said. If you hate your brother and you're walking in darkness, he still believes that. You know, I was thinking when my children were young, we would discipline them, and we discipline them in several different ways. But the thing that we always were mindful to do is that after we disciplined them, we assured them that we still love them. And I believe that John here is doing that exact same thing. You see, I believe that John is a very fatherly figure to the church. John was an amazing man. He's the only of Jesus' disciples that was never killed for his faith. He was definitely persecuted, but he was never martyred for his faith. John was known as the apostle of love, but yet John speaks in a very correcting way. He speaks in a way that says, if you hate your brother, you're walking in darkness. How many of you know that's pretty challenging? But now John is turning and he's talking to them in a very loving way. And this is what he says again, 1 John, the second chapter, verse number 12. And he says, I'm writing to you who are God's children. Who's he writing to? He's writing to believers. He's writing to God's children. And this is what he says, because your sins have been forgiven through Jesus. What's he saying? Now he's just talked about sin. He's just talked about people living in darkness because they hate their brother. But now he comes to them and he says, you know what? Your sins have been forgiven. You see, I believe that one of the reasons why believers act the way they do is because they really don't have an understanding of God's forgiveness towards them. You know, Jesus said that because we are forgiven, we need to forgive. But you know what? If you're a believer and you're walking around and you don't really understand that your sins have been forgiven, you know what? It's very difficult for you to understand forgiving someone else. And so John here is bringing a very loving message, along with correction, but a very loving message to the church. And he's saying, little children, he's saying, you small ones. Actually, the word here for children means the small ones, the little ones, God's little children. And he says, because your sins have been forgiven through Jesus. What's he doing? He's bringing them a tremendous amount of assurance. Your sins have been forgiven. Wow. But then he goes on in verse number 13. And he says, I'm writing to you who are mature in faith. Now, some of the translations say, I'm writing to you who are fathers. But I believe here, the way that the New International Version has translated this, I really like how they translate this verse, because it says, those of you who are mature in faith. How many of you know that Christian maturity, it has some to do with age, but there's a lot of believers who have been believers for many years, but they are not mature in the faith. They have not come to a place of maturity. And so John here is writing, and now he's saying, I'm writing to you who are mature in faith. In other words, he is pointing to some of those people He may have been pointing to Mary. Mary, Jesus' mother, was living in Ephesus, and John was taking care of her, and he may have been saying to people like Mary, hey, Mary, you're mature in the faith, and this is a message for you. He's saying, because you know Christ. Now, what is the thing that John says here that sets a believer in a place of maturity? Is it that they have a doctor's degree in theology? No. Is it that they have perfect attendance? I was raised in a wonderful, wonderful church, but we had perfect attendance pins. And if we had perfect attendance for a year, we would get a little pin, a little attachment to that pin. And you know what? Perfect attendance didn't make any difference. The thing that makes a difference and the thing that brings a believer into a place of maturity, John mentions here, and he says, because you know Christ. You know Christ. You see, when John talks about knowing Christ here, he's not just talking about having a knowledge of Christ. How many of you realize that there are a lot of people that have a knowledge of Christ, but they are not living in maturity as believers? So John says, because you know Christ. In other words, because you're walking with him, because you're living with him, because you're walking in the light. You're not hating your brother, but you're walking in the light. And this is what he says, who existed from the beginning. I am writing to you who are young in faith. Now he's writing to a different category. He's saying, I'm writing to you who are young in faith. And this is what he says, because you have won your battle with the evil one. In other words, you have made this decision that you are not going to be ruled by the evil one, but you're going to battle him. You're a warrior. You see, the children are children in the faith. The young men are people who are warring against the evil one in their own personal life. They're doing battle against the evil one. And then we find these people who are mature in faith, and they are mature in faith because they know Christ who existed from the beginning, because they have a relationship with Jesus Christ. Now, we're going to continue teaching along these lines in our next podcast. So I'd welcome you to come back and to continue to listen to these podcasts. If you like what you're hearing, hit that little like button. If you really like what you're hearing, go ahead and subscribe. It will bless us and it will help us to reach other people. And our prayer for you, who no matter who you are, is that God will bless you abundantly.